Welcome to Off the Cuff with Kel Conversations from the Frontline, where we empower survivors' voices and challenge the status quo. I am your host, Kelly Humphries, survivor, advocate, author, speaker, researcher, ambassador, and a seasoned former first responder. Supported by the team at Media 8, Off the Cuff with Kel is about growth and healing, leadership through trauma, awareness and understanding. We bring you compelling stories of courage, transformation and expert insights, along with candid discussions on the challenges victims and survivors face. Off the Cuff with Kel celebrates our shared humanity, blending deep vulnerability with humour. Each episode is crafted with love, honesty and the emotions that bind us, whether it's laughter or tears, promoting resilience and hope. Please note, some of the discussions we have can be hard to hear and include sexual abuse themes, online exploitation, domestic and family violence and trauma. So, listener discretion is advised. Please join us as we change the world one story at a time, embracing courage through vulnerability. All right. Hello and welcome to Off the Cuff with Kel. I'm so excited. I have my dear friend, the wonderful Dr. Michael Salter, who I've been waiting very well. Look, I probably could have asked you earlier, but I've been waiting for this moment to get you here. So welcome, Michael. Thank you for being part of Off the Cuff.
Pleasure.
Yeah, I love it. I'm so excited because the thing about Michael, right, and now that I'm like, I can say the words, I'm a researcher, right? I haven't been able to say that before. I've been reading so much of your work and I'm so impressed by the way that you write, your rawness, your authenticity, and just the way that you don't sugarcoat anything, right? Like you tell it how it is. And I think for so many victims and survivors, it is such a beautiful thing to have the truth told. And from me reading, like, it's been tough, but I just wanted to say right from the get-go, I totally just love your work and I really, really appreciate what you're doing in this space. So first and foremost, thank you for having the courage to write and to do what you do. So I get to say that publicly, not just to your face. So I just wanted to put that out there. So thank you very much.
No, thanks, Cal. I mean, that means a lot to me. And, I'm an academic. I write for an academic audience, but really the people that I'm writing for are survivors. And it's about making sure that, what I put out into the world is accountable back to the people for whom it matters the most. And that's the people that have been through it. And, when I started doing this work, my view was actually academia was pretty complicit in the culture of silence. And I didn't really come to this work with a lot of respect for academia, to be honest. So, being a researcher does give us a voice and a platform, but it gives us a responsibility that I don't think has always been used properly before. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I've had some conversations with others, survivors who are working in academia, about exactly what you're talking about there. And I think it's a whole other podcast, but I just wanted to say I totally hear you. And as someone who's just stepped into this space, and, I'm kind of like a jack of all trades, master of none, like a little bit of a bogan and, a fence jumper for barbed wire fences from way back and country bumpkin, So reading academic papers for me is I kind of got it when I was in college, but now it sort of doesn't always translate into something I fully understand. And it's taken me quite some time, but there's this real gap, I think, in translating academia to, the people that really need to hear it. And I think that's something in your papers that really shows up for me as like, well, I can't miss the truth in that, can I? So
yeah, and sometimes, like academia is a middle class game, and it is a bit of a game, and it's a game that academics play amongst themselves. And most academics did go to private schools and have quite privileged upbringings. And so, to be really honest, when working class people come to academic texts and they're reading it and they're like, I can't understand this and it doesn't make any sense, it might not be because you don't have the skill to read it. It might actually be because the paper's garbage and doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So I guess I just encourage you like not to lose that instinct, because there is like a bullshit barometer that is really important to keep around you in order to cut through some of the crap, because there is a lot of it in academic work.
Where do I buy one of those?
Bullshit barometer. I think yours might be built in, Kel. I think you're okay.
Oh, yeah. Right. I think I've honed that. The 16 years in law enforcement can do that. So, Michael, you've got over 50 academic papers. I just noticed recently, and congratulations, Childlight has granted, I'm sorry, I don't remember the numbers, but a whole bunch of money for you to take the leadership of Childlight in Australia and to really further the agenda. And I guess accountability around making sure things happen in Australia. That's what I understand it. But I'd love you to just talk really briefly about what that looks like before we start, because I really want to jump in and rip some band-aids off tonight with some familial CSAM offending stuff, because I really want to get into that. But please just humor me, and if you could just talk a little bit about that, I'd love it.
Yeah, so look, just very briefly, so Childlight is the Global Child Safety Institute. It's based at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. It was funded by the Human Dignity Foundation, and it's quite a significant endowment from HDF. And so Childlight has funded me for the next 3 years at the University of New South Wales. So that'll allow me to set up like the Australasian office of Childlight. So we will be spearheading the Childlight-related research in the region, so both in Australia, but also in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So we'll set up a team and we'll just start doing that work. The real commitment for Childlight is around data and around getting a global data baseline on the extent of the problem of child sexual abuse, and using that baseline to hold governments to account. When governments say that they're tackling child sexual abuse, well, let's see if what they're doing is working. But in the online space, also holding the vested interests to account, and that includes particularly the tech sector. We launched the Childlight Index last week. So that's the first global index on child sexual abuse and exploitation. Part of the index includes an analysis of the extent of online victimization of children in the last 12 months. And the number was 300 million kids, 300 million kids sexually abused online in the last 12 months. So these are the kind of high-level findings that Childlight produces, so that civil society, so that survivors can pick those figures up and really use it to drive the point home.
Wasn't it something like 7.5% of men have committed a sexual offense against a child online? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So that's my data. So I conducted a perpetration prevalence study here in Australia. It was a representative sample of 2,000 Australian men. And what we found was that 7.5% of Australian men acknowledged committing an online sexual offence against a child at some point in their life, whether that was viewing child sexual abuse material, whether that was having a sexual conversation with somebody who they knew was a child online, sexual webcamming with a child, or purchasing any sexual videos or images that they knew depicted children. So, yeah, that's 7.5% of Australian men.
It's almost something like you think is made up. I know myself as a survivor, and I know working in the sector, I know that's not true. But I think some of the things that I've been kind of like before I got on and I had this conversation, I was like, all right, what are the myths around familial CSAM offending? What are the issues that we have? Because part of what I wanted to do was make CSAM real to Australia. Like, I know there's so many of us working in the space to try to highlight the prevalence of online offending, but I just don't think people get it, and I don't know how to make them get it, you know. And statistics are one thing, and I think that's something you can't ignore. It's like, that's what the stats actually tell us, but what about what we don't know, right? What about the people that are too afraid to say, well, actually, yeah, that was me. So is it really higher?
That's right. I mean, we can only ask the men the questions that we ask, but we had about 1 in 6 Australian men acknowledge some sexual interest in people under the age of 18. And when we start to break that data down, like, it was 5, 6, 7% of men who were saying that they were sexually interested in young children, like children under 10, children under 12. So if you think about that as a kind of a market, it's not a small market. It's a market that's not being allowed, TV is not allowed to cater to that market. Radio is not allowed to cater to that market. But the tech sector is. The tech sector doesn't have the kind of safeguards that other media sectors do. And so essentially for the tech sector, the pedophile market is a very lucrative one. And we know that because when we look at the numbers of child sexual abuse images that are being, and videos that are being reported every year, last year it was somewhere in the order of 86 million images that were detected. And we're seeing 50% increases year on year. And we've seen those increases for 20 years. And somehow no one's ringing the alarm bells. No one's saying that this is outrageous and disgusting and has to stop. Those increases have been allowed to happen for 2 decades.
Yeah, I don't understand that either. And I know our e-safety commissioner, if anyone think that, if anyone is out there thinking that there's not someone fighting for this space, there really is. I know our e-safety commissioner is, she pushes so heavily and works so hard to work with tech companies to get, I think the wording, and correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, safety by design, and trying to really push the agenda of making sure tech companies are accountable to, notifying, detecting, and, following up on these reports. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's not really happening. So...
Look, I mean, most CSAM that's detected each year is what we call known CSAM. So at CSAM, there's already been identified as CSAM. It's already registered as such by Interpol. What that means is that there's actually technology to block this content at the point of upload. As far as I'm concerned, any online service or hosting provider that can be used to distribute this material should have a firewall in front of it that is making sure that any material that is known CSAM is blocked at the point of upload. So even for those tech companies that are doing some scanning, the issue is they're allowing known CSAM onto their service in the first place, and it's then distributed to some extent before they detect it. So even the good operators, and that includes Facebook or Instagram, who do scan for known CSAM, as far as I'm concerned, it should never have hit their servers in the first place. It should have been blocked. And the idea that it's okay for that material to go online in the first place is just bizarre to me, but that's the world that we live in.
I think I'd like to go back, if we can, Michael, and just define CSAM, because I think for a lot of people, they don't really understand what CSAM is. So CSAM by definition is child sexual abuse material, but I'd love you to maybe give a bit of a perspective of what that kind of includes, because I was talking with my survivors group as part of our research, and we're trying to, and if anyone's out there listening and you are a victim survivor of online child sexual exploitation, please reach out to me. But we recognize that perhaps a lot of people don't understand that what happened to them wasn't okay, that it was an actual offense, and that it was abuse, so to speak. So I'd love you to maybe talk to that a little bit, if you could. Just define it a little bit to give us some context. Yeah.
So, I mean, under Australian law, CSAM is any material that sexually exploits a child. So CSAM can be an image, it can be a video. CSAM can be text as well. So a written story can be CSAM. CSAM can also be drawn, computer generated, and so on. So it's any material that sexually exploits a child. Most of the time when we're talking about CSAM, we are talking about images and videos. So those can be images and videos of children that is clearly sexual in nature. So the child might be alone, the child might be with other children, or it might be an image or a video of a child being sexually assaulted. We also have content where children have been induced to produce their own material. So through a webcam, the offender may have never met the child, but the offender has been able to induce the child to engage in sexual behavior online that the offender has then recorded, which has become increasingly common ways for offenders to produce material. That said, the most popular in-demand content, and it's important just to say this so that people understand the nature of the market, is images and videos of quite young children, so 5 or 6 year olds being sexually assaulted by adults. That's primarily the market for CSAM. Nonetheless, there is a lot of images and videos of kids on webcam, that kind of material. It does float around, but the offenders are really looking for quite egregious content.
Right. So I think, see, the thing for me, and just going back to what I said earlier, is to making this real to our community. I think really there's this whole perception that, first of all, that it's a historical thing, right? It happened way back when, and it's not applicable. It's not happening right now. Or it's happened in an institution. It's happened in a school. It's happened by like a priest or something, like a sports club or something like that. They're not sort of thinking, of organized type abuse or abuse where a parent, heaven forbid, a parent is actually perpetuating abuse. And so, there's this whole concept that it couldn't possibly happen. My partner would never do that. My husband, my wife would never be involved in something like that. And this whole thought that, if something was going to happen to my child, they're going to tell me about it. Of course, they're going to tell me about it. Or the school's going to teach them, right? The school's going to tell them what they need to know and how to protect themselves. So therefore, I don't have to do anything, right? So these are the kinds of things I'm kind of, I've kind of come across in my advocacy. And, I really struggle because we know the numbers, right? The Australian Child Maltreatment Study. And again, of what we know. So 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys before the age of 18 will be sexually abused. 89% by someone that they know. And, I'm not sure the crossover. So I did want to check with you because I know you'll have that number. If we've got this many people, 1 in 3 and 1 in 5, 28.5% of the population, what percentage of that is supposedly online perpetration? So they've got that crossover of not just child sex assault, but also then that assault being filmed and shared.
So believe it or not, the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, the figures that you've just quoted, contains no online offending. They haven't actually released the data on the online offence category. So that is only contact offending.
Right.
And so, in fact, the online offending is additional to what you've just described. Now, bearing in mind also that the capacity to sexually abuse a child online has increased over the last 20 years. So even, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was first using the internet, it was mostly text-based. There was very little streaming. There was certainly nothing like a webcam. So online offending had a narrow scope. Now that's changed quite a lot in the last 10 years with the availability of broadband and so on. So we have we're really seeing the first generation of kids who could have been sexually abused online are only now coming of age. And so I think we really need to pay attention, particularly to that recent experience. Now, the other thing that I would say, and I think this was interesting in the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, was of all categories of adult offender, the largest category of adult offender was a parent or a caregiver in the home. Now, that's interesting for us to think about because that's probably not the story we've been told about adult offending against children. I think the story we've been told is that it's mostly in the child circle trust, maybe it's extended family, maybe it's institutional. That was not the finding of the Child Maltreatment Study. And the other point that I would make is for offenders who want to access young children, so 4 or 5-year-olds, it's actually quite hard to access a 4 or 5-year-old. It's not easy. You basically have to work in daycare or school. And over the last 30, 40 years, we've put a lot of safeguards in place to stop offenders accessing kids in daycare and schools. Now, it's not perfect, but we're much better now than we were in the 80s. What it means is that for the men who are quite motivated to abuse young kids, the most efficient way to do that is to actually start a family or to find a family. And this is a category of offender who I think has snuck under the radar of forensic psychology for a long time. One reason is that forensic psychologists have not listened closely enough to survivors, and survivors have been talking about this category of offender for a very long time. But also these men are quite hard to catch because offences against young children are the hardest to detect, and they're the hardest to prosecute because young kids don't disclose. And when they do disclose, Australian courts are pretty reluctant to accept their evidence. So there's a real blind spot in our response to child sexual abuse that family-based abuse sits very squarely within, and it is enabling a particularly pernicious and extreme sort of organised abuse to take place because frankly we're not paying attention.
I found that, I don't find that hard to believe. I just think that it's just a very as you said, very motivated offender. And I think there's ways where they're finding families, and I know I've mentioned this in my podcast before about targeting women through dating apps. Yeah. As you said, if they can't make their own family, they'll find their own family. And so I am aware that through those dating apps, women are also heavily groomed and become complicit in abusing their children to the point of sending sexually explicit photographs to that perpetrator. Am I right?
That's right. So, I mean, these guys, they might get in touch with 1,000 women in a week, and they only need one woman to fall for the trick. And that's true for some of these offenders who are operating offline and are looking for a female partner to either access children she already has or to start their own families. They're doing the same thing. They're looking for weak points. They're looking for opportunities. So, and we see this on the dark web. We see offenders talking about their techniques, sharing techniques about how to groom someone through a dating app, how to convince a woman to do things that she wouldn't otherwise do. And now that's a small minority of women, but unfortunately, when we're working with survivors who are disclosing that really early onset abuse in a family context, it's not uncommon that we'll hear about a collusive or participatory mother. But the other thing I'll say is that, for the women who do detect the abuse and they initiate a separation and they report him to the police, they're having shocking experiences in the family court system. So it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, because where you do have protective mothers reporting sexual abuse of young kids, which, to be clear, is very difficult to substantiate. That woman might have a very clear disclosure from the child, but that might be all that she has, and there's no medical evidence, which is typical of sexual abuse. She is going to have a very difficult time in the courts getting them to agree that her husband is a risk to their children. So it's an incredibly difficult position to be in.
I can see where you're coming from with that. And then I guess the word parental alienation is popping into my head, because the number of people that reach out to me, and I really struggle with this, to be honest, because I don't think there's any answers specifically when they're saying, my ex-partner is doing this, my child is saying this, where do I go, what do I do? Because there's no evidence, and because the child can't quite, verbalize or disclose properly what's happening to them. And, whether there's filming or not filming, how that child is just not believed. And I think that's, the biggest issue was just like, oh, they're only 5, they're only 4. Like, she doesn't really know what she's talking about. And it's easy to gaslight that child, particularly if the offender or the, mother, per se, will go and speak to the offender and say, hey, did you do this? And they're like, no, she doesn't know what she's talking about. Or he doesn't know what he's talking about. And it's so easy to manipulate that really particularly vulnerable group of children.
It's partly about judicial education. So, I mean, I'm designing the training module for the Federal and Family Court at the moment on child sexual exploitation, and I have actually presented this work to them. And we're doing some training in Victoria at the end of the month. So it's partly about just providing the data to decision makers and fact finders in the courts. Because what we found in our study of men who sexually abuse children is there was about 5% of Australian men who had two things. So they indicated that they were sexually interested in kids, and they indicated that they were offending. And there was another group of offenders actually who indicated they were offending, but they didn't have any particular sexual preference for children, which is an interesting topic. But if we focus on the 5 men who sexually abusing kids and had sexual interest in children, those men had quite a good psychosocial profile. So actually, they were more likely to be high income. They were more likely to be married. We had questions about their level of social support. Those men had the highest levels of like social support and friendship of all of the men in our study. They had good relationships. They were married. They were 3 times more likely to work with children. And, you know, many of them had a child in the house. So if you looked at our research findings, these men look very respectable, actually. But behind the scenes, there was another story going on. Not only the sexual abuse of children, but they were consuming large amounts of pornography. That pornography was quite deviant. It was pornography with force. They were 27 times more likely to be consuming pornography that depicts animals. Behind the scenes, behind this kind of quite polite, kind of middle-class, respectable facade, they had a kind of a very high level of sexual preoccupation and sexual disorder. And so that's part of the judicial education piece, is saying to judges and magistrates, this is the typical sex offender. And he's a specialist. He's not doing any other criminal offending. He only wants to abuse children. He's not doing anything else illegal, and he specializes in it. You know, he's developed techniques over time not to be detected. The men that we saw in our study, they were using encryption at really high rate. They were using other online privacy software to make sure that no one could track what they were doing online. So they were quite premeditated. So, I mean, the family court is a really difficult jurisdiction. It's a really messy jurisdiction. I'm not envious of family court judges. I think it's a very tough job to have, but hopefully by furnishing them with some of this evidence, we can help them to understand the reality of offending, and frankly also the reality of CSAM. And a lot of judges and magistrates refuse to view child sexual abuse material, which is understandable. But what it means is that they actually don't understand what the men are looking at. And they don't understand how serious it is. And I do think that if they viewed the content, at least some of the content, we would see different decisions being made in court. Because I think at the moment there's a tendency to minimize the risk that online offenders are posing to children, particularly if someone is charged for possession and not production or distribution, but they're found to possess child sexual abuse material. They're generally not getting a custodial sentence. And I would say in my discussions with victims and survivors of CSAM, they consider that a pretty egregious injustice.
Yeah, and I think too, with what you're saying, the survivor voice is missing in there, and it's about the person in the image, like, you know, making decisions just on a possession. Well, there's still a victim there. There's still somebody who's had to experience that abuse, and not looking at those images, I think, misses that. It misses what that child actually had to go through, and I think it totally desensitizes the magistrate in doing that. And I was talking today with Sonia Ryan from the Kelly Humphries Foundation about they have a community impact statement in South Australia, which talks about you know, the impact on the community, the impact on the child, the impact on those around the child as a result of the CSAM offending. And you know, they're having a lot of apparently higher rates of conviction and sentencing because at least there's some understanding of what the victim has had to go through. And you know, there's a lot of work being done. Part of the research project, as you know, that I'm doing with the ALEX lab, puts the survivor voice in the CSAM and, the needs of those survivors. And so it's really valuable what you're saying, particularly in the court process and sentencing process. And, magistrates not viewing that content, I totally agree with you. I think they need to look at some of the content to see that, person behind that, and there to be a victim impact statement, because if there's not, I think victims and survivors feel like their voice is not being heard, and there's no context around, what they're made to do. Victims and survivors are often made to act or to perform in a certain way to please an offender or to do something that they otherwise would never do in order to stay safe. And so, again, it's just a survival mechanism in this process that is very rarely understood. The grooming is not understood. The complex nature of the organizational abuse is not understood. And without those key understandings, how can anybody really believe the child or what they're experiencing or what the victim is having to go through in order to get through this? Like, at the very least. Yeah,
survivors often feel like they've been reduced to the image or the video in the court process, because the courts refer to, oh, he had these many images and videos in category 1. He had these many files in category 2 of severity, blah, blah, blah. They don't say he had images and videos of this many children. Excuse me. And so it's also about, it's about humanizing survivors and making them people and not colluding in the objectification of the offenders. I mean, to cycle back to the theme of sort of tonight, the most popular in-demand content is of fathers sexually abusing their daughters. That's the material that circulates the most. And so if you think about those survivors now, they're living with the ongoing injury and humiliation of what their father did, and then the fact it was distributed, and then the fact that you've got hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people that are viewing this content over a long period of time, the humiliation of the fact that the tech sector won't take this content down, even though they could. In the United States, known victims have the right to know, so they can opt in to an FBI system whereby any time their CSAM is detected in law enforcement seizure, the victim or their legal representative is notified. What that also means is that at the point of sentencing, they can give a personal victim impact statement. So I am the child in some of these images. It also means that their lawyer, once the criminal prosecution is finished, their lawyer can circle back and sue the offender for emotional damages. And I would really like to see this in place in Australia. And I would really like to see our victims and survivors having access to the court system in the US, but also having Australian courts participate in this process as well. Because if these men are not going to get, if they're not going to get incarcerated for possession, then they can certainly pay for the injury and damage that they're doing to Australian children.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And I know that there's been lots of talk about that, amongst ourselves and, with this research and moving forward, I really would like to see that as well. There's, as you know, massive gaps in support for CSAM survivors, end-to-end support. What is that? It doesn't exist. And these are things that I think we really need to be stepping up in. And I do believe this will come out of the research that I'm conducting with the Alex Lab. So very passionate about this, as you know, and Michael, we spoke at the symposium. This was something that you and I both brought up separately, the fact that there is just a real lack of support for CSAM survivors. So, as a CSA survivor, I can Google, where I can find support, and I know that there's going to be somebody who can specifically tailor their support to meet my needs. But when we're talking about CSAM, there's some real differences that don't pertain to CSA survivors that pertain to CSAM survivors that we really miss. And that takes a specialist understanding in order to meet the needs of those particular victims and survivors. And, we're talking about things like you mentioned earlier, that content is continually online. It's being continually viewed, which means the victim and the survivor is continually being victimized and re-victimized. And as you're mentioning before, for those who don't really understand, an offender who has, when you're talking about known imagery, we're talking about an image that may pop up in a different offender's set of images. So that victim survivor would be notified again that they've been victimized, and then it may pop up again. And so they're being constantly told and talked that, informed that this image is turning up in other perpetrators' data sets. So they're constantly being reminded that their material is being viewed. So the purpose of those victim impact statements is to alleviate that re-traumatization by having that impact statement available, so that they don't have to be continually harassed and re-victimized and re-traumatized by this material continuing to show up. So it's a much bigger picture than most of us can fully understand. And those CSAM survivors, it takes a real particular set of skills to support them end to end, from the moment of reporting through to, the end of the legal process. But us as trauma survivors, even CSA survivors amongst us, will know that it doesn't go away. At different parts of our life, trauma will show up, when we have children, or when we get married, or, we meet different people, or someone, is a CSA survivor and discloses to us, and we'll be triggered at different times throughout our lifespan. It's the same with CSAM survivors. And so, that end-to-end support that doesn't exist really needs to support those survivors as they continue throughout this process. And the victim impact statement, it would be a massive help in that space, I would think. I would like to, we talked a bit about female offending. I really want to ask you about the numbers on that, because I have several thousand things in my brain, but I can't quite pinpoint the stats or the facts on that. And we couldn't possibly think of females being offenders. I mean, come on, females don't abuse their children, do they, Michael?
So I mean, obviously the majority of people that abuse children are men. But women play, particularly in the context of sexual exploitation, quite an important role. And so when we're looking at sexual exploitation, when we're looking at CSAM offending, when we're looking at networked offending where there's multiple offenders, this is where we quite commonly see female offenders. They may be contact offenders, so they may be engaged in the abuse. They may be colluding in different ways. So even if they're not actively participating in the abuse, they know about it. They're keeping the secret. They're controlling the child. And frankly, we do have some female pedophiles, and I've certainly done work with survivors where there's been sexual abuse in their family, and their mother was the primary offender and the primary participant, and it was the person that was really driving that forward. So I think that can be hard to listen to, and I know in my own career, it actually took me years and years to really hear that from survivors. I kept making excuses or assuming there must be domestic violence or something like that. And I really had a survivor not hit me over the head, but kind of verbally just say, shut up and listen to what I need to tell you about who my mother was and what she did. What we're also seeing surface in the criminal justice at the moment in terms of historical court cases is actually female teachers who were sexually abusing sometimes quite young boys, 10, 11, 12 in the context of school. And in fact, we just had a case in New South Wales where this was essentially struck out because when she was alleged to have committed these offences in 1978, it was actually found against quite young boys, that they were 10, 11, 12. It was actually found that what she was doing wasn't illegal. Even if she was found to have committed the offences, that in 1978, it actually wasn't illegal for a woman to sexually abuse a boy. And so effectively her conduct was lawful. So it is something that we just need to keep an open mind about. I sometimes hear people, I think, go a bit overboard with, oh, well, as many women do it as men, but we just don't hear about it. I don't think that that's the case at all. But we have to take really seriously these reports, and we have to take seriously the fact that, in my line of work, sometimes women are willing to sacrifice their child in exchange for a romantic relationship. Or sometimes they're willing to participate in the abuse of their child if it means keeping their marriage together. Those are some of the scenarios that we come across in the kind of family-based abuse scenario, and that we just have to think through carefully.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I wanted to kind of get to with this part of the conversation, because so many victims and survivors share with me, you know, my mum knew about this and she didn't do anything, or I disclosed to my mum what was happening and she, you know, didn't believe me, or she let it happen, or she enabled it, or, you know, and for myself, like my situation, my uncle was my perpetrator, but for as long as I could remember, I thought my aunt knew what was going on. But even after prosecution, she stayed with him, right?
Yep.
And I just couldn't understand for as long, even now, I still go, well, what more did you need to hear for you to, you know, stay in this relationship with this man and have a child with him? What part of that made you need to stay? And for this, she, you know, obviously didn't have, you know, a great deal of self-esteem and those types of things. And I thought, you know, I get it, but I still don't in my survivor heart think, you know, why the hell would you show support to somebody like this and have a child to somebody like this, and put your child in a situation where they may be potentially vulnerable to being sexually exploited when you know, and it's not just the first offense, it's the second, you know, I just think, oh my God, but that's a very minor situation compared to so many who's disclosed at a very young age and then they're, you know, not believed and continually having to be exposed to the perpetrator. And for so many survivors, they just don't understand that. They don't get why did my mum stay with them? Why did they allow it? And you know, you covered off on some of those reasons. And again, you see the romantic relationship, you know, I think there's a lot of fear. If I say something, I'm, you know, they're going to hurt me, or, you know, and I can't think of it, it's domestic violence in a way, but it's also grooming, right? Many of them also don't know. The survivor in us wants to think that they do. And for a long time, I kind of just hoped that one of my parental figures would just kind of stop what was happening, and, you know, thinking that surely they can see something. But the skill and the art of a perpetrator is so cunning. And I think we often forget that they groom families in order to have access to children, and they groom the people around the child. But again, I still can't answer why the female most of the time would stay in a relationship with the sexual offender. I don't really understand.
And yeah, there's a couple of reasons for that. And I want to emphasize, I know lots of women who, once they discovered that he was an offender, they left. They were horrified and they left. Often they need some space to process this, you know, and I think sometimes there can be like a knee-jerk disbelief and a knee-jerk like allegiance with him. But if she's given a bit of space to think this through and just process the shock, because it can be a huge shock. So I think that's part of it. But also, to be honest, these men, when they partner with someone who they can partner with as well. And that might be someone who is morally compromised, or someone who is easier to corrupt. And I think that, you know, most of the time in these scenarios, these are women who would never, ever off their own accord, this, you know, engage in this behavior. But over the course of the relationship, there's a moral undermining and corruption that goes on, such that their self-protective, their protective instincts and their safeguarding instincts are eroded. They may not have had them. A lot of these women themselves have their own history of child sexual abuse, and that can mean that they've got a big blind spot if they haven't processed their own trauma. So I think, you know, we can intellectualize it, we can try to understand it, but it doesn't displace the betrayal, and it doesn't displace the fact that somebody has prioritized their own comfort and their own security and their own convenience, let's be honest, their own convenience over the safety of a child, and over their obligations to somebody that's been harmed by their partner. And it is despicable. It's morally despicable. And so again, we can try and understand it, but in the end, we have to, I think, recognize it's a really despicable thing to do.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think for many who are in that situation, there's a lot of confusion, and you know, they maybe they did this, maybe did that, like justification, I guess, for the action or the inaction, so to speak. And I think for any survivors who are listening, I think it was really key for you to say that it really wasn't okay. It wasn't right. And, you know, whilst things, it's like understanding someone who commits a crime. We get why they did it, but it doesn't make it okay. It doesn't make it right. And, you know, there's absolutely no real excuse for that. And it doesn't displace how it makes a survivor feel. So I really appreciate that you said that, because I think for a lot of survivors, there's a lot of confusion around whether it was right or wrong, or making excuses for that parent, when really they should have just done the right thing. So
there's a great quote from Maya Angelou, and I must say it to myself every day. And she says, you know, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. You know, when someone shows you their true self, their core self, she said, believe them the first time. And so if someone sides with their sexually abusive husband after he's committed a sexual offense against a child and been charged and convicted, they're showing you who they are. You know, they're not hiding who they are. So believe them, you know. And I think that releases us from this endless treadmill, hamster wheel we can be on, trying to understand why. And it's like, no, this is who they are. And they told me who they are, and this is who they are, and I believe them. And then we can just kind of, you know, just give ourselves some relief.
I like that. It makes sense. Yeah, all right. So just to clarify, so let's just like summarize all this up, and then we've got a few questions that we're going to answer. So the people that are committing the offenses here, we're talking are mostly familial, right?
So in terms of the largest category of adult offender, yes, according to the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, caregiver or parent in the home. Now, there's obviously other categories, but that was a large category. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then there's a crossover. There's a certain percentage of those which are women. And I know, again, I'm treading very carefully around this issue. Many of these women are either perpetrators, or they actually enable the abuse, or, you know, bystanders, as so to speak. So I guess the reason I just want to recap on this is to make it really clear that it's not some foreign person in another land. Yes, there's sextortion. Yes, there's risks online, but more often than not, the perpetrators that are the most risky, the most dangerous, the most conniving, the most manipulative, are those who are behind closed doors, who we're not talking about. And egregious means bad. It means really bad. It means torture. It means rape. It means horrific things that you possibly could never imagine happening to these children. And this is the majority of the sexual offending that is occurring. And we have to really think about that. We don't talk about it. That's why this podcast exists, is to lift the lid on this and to highlight these very real issues, and to make it a conversation that, not to make it a normal because it's never going to be a normal conversation, but to take away the shame around this, because we have to be talking about this to make change. We have to be talking about this. And if you haven't had a conversation with your child, you have to ask yourself, is it already too late? So I'm going to just put it back to you, Michael. What are some of the things, really quickly, and then we'll answer some questions. What are some of the things that need to be communicated to your kids about this? to really give them the ability to have this conversation?
I think there's a couple of things. You know, it would be good, and I don't have a silver bullet for this, but I would really like to think about how we talk to kids about grooming, because that is how they get access to kids. So what we tend to do is talk to kids about sexual abuse in terms of their bodies, right? So if anyone touches you, like, these are private parts of your body, you know, you have control over that. And that's a really important thing to say. The issue is offenders are quite good at overcoming, you know, kids' boundaries, and kids don't have a lot of boundaries. That's part of just being a kid. So I would like us to sort of think through in a more sophisticated way how we help kids understand grooming. And frankly, we need to teach everyone about grooming, because, you know, as you pointed out, Kel, we sort of all get groomed. I think we also just need to be really upfront and unembarrassed with kids about bodies and sex, and it needs to be kind of age appropriate. But, you know, people are really worried about that. And I mean, I'll give a couple of examples. I know survivors of family-based abuse who, when they got their period, they thought they were going to die, because the way that their dad got away with it was he told them nothing about physiology and anatomy at all. So she had no information about reproductive health. And so literally when she began to bleed at 12, she thought she was going to die. And it's just an illustration of how vulnerable kids can be and how intentionally ignorant offenders can keep kids. And the other example I'll give, and sorry, it's a little bit graphic, but it's really important, is, you know, somebody who I did research with, where actually a lot of her sexual abuse was involved anal penetration. And so she got the birds and the bees talk in the way that everyone does, but that's not what was happening to her. And it was actually only in her 20s that she was able to put a name to the type of offending that was done against her. So sometimes we think that we're protecting kids by not telling them about things that maybe make us uncomfortable. But in doing that, we are leaving kids quite vulnerable. So, you know, and it's often because we're embarrassed to talk about those things. And so being able to deal with our embarrassment and then just being able to be quite upfront and unembarrassed with kids, I think is really helpful.
I could not agree with you more. Age appropriate conversations, and you know, I have to say this too, and you know, those who've listened to any of my podcasts will know, my mum did not disclose her abuse. So she's a sexual abuse survivor, but she did not disclose until I disclosed, and she kept her secret for over 30 years, right? So conversations are powerful. You know, I absolutely see no reason you cannot share any of your lived experience with a child in an age appropriate way, because what that does is, if something happens, it says, hey, you know, and I can trust you and you're safe. And there's this unconscious understanding or subconscious understanding, you know, that you can just look at and you go, you know, you understand, you get it. And even teenagers are terrible, right? Like they're so aggressive and angry and, you know, screamy and yelly and like, you don't get it, you don't know. But inside, internally, when you've had those conversations, they know that you're safe. And again, Michael, I just could not agree with you any more. You know, I know some of those examples are hard to hear, but they're the conversations we need to have. And it really is about, we get selfish because we don't want to feel uncomfortable. You know, people often ask, how do I even start the conversation? Just start it, you know, lock the kid in the car. They can't get away from you, and make sure that they're listening, or, you know, just when the opportunity arises, just start having the conversation. But not having the conversation is really setting up kids to fail, I think. So yeah, there's a couple of questions, Michael. So just really quickly, child light, is that correct? Is child light?
Right. Child light, yes.
Perfect. And we can kind of bundle this up into one question is, but why don't the magistrates view the content? If the victim doesn't have a choice but has to go through it, why shouldn't the judges be viewing it?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and they don't want to subject themselves to it. They don't want the trauma of seeing the material. And I understand that. But in fact, viewing CSAM for lawful reasons, it does not destroy your mental health. It does not ruin you for life. For research purposes, I've viewed content in the conduct of research, and I've survived. And it's not the worst thing that I've had to do as a researcher. I find it much harder doing interview work with survivors who are really damaged and where I'm not sure they're going to recover. That kind of thing's really, really, I find much more traumatic than CSAM, which is images and videos of exactly what it sounds like, kids being abused, which is terrible. But particularly if you're looking at that content in solidarity with the survivor, in their interest. And unfortunately, I think we have an ignorant judiciary that just doesn't understand the perversity of the content these men are looking at. And I think, excuse me, there's just a tendency to minimize it.
Yeah, and I think too, again, just going back to the fact that if there's no victim impact statement, there can't be a context around what's happening. And I just think that's so important that the survivor voice is heard. It's not just a bunch of images, or it's not just a description, because a description is only one person's perception of what that means, right? It's usually what happens is the magistrate will view a description which is written by a police officer who has had to categorize and review that content and prepare a brief for court. And so what they do is they write their description of what they're seeing, but that's a subjective description according to what that officer's seeing. And so then the magistrate's reading that description, which is, again, it's one person's perception of what's been seen. So without having that survivor voice and without actually viewing it, they're not actually getting this holistic picture of what's actually occurred. And there could be thousands and thousands of images. So I think it's very difficult, but you're right. I really believe, again, that they do have to view it. There's just no other way. Not the whole lot, obviously, but some of it. they've got to get the idea. So, yeah. All right. So look, Michael, I'll just get your contact details put up onto the screen. So if you would like to get in contact with Michael, this is his LinkedIn. His LinkedIn link is on screen. So yeah, there's quite a lot of work that will be coming out of Child Light moving forward. So I'm actually really, really looking forward to what happens, because for me, I just get excited that there's action, right? I keep seeing all these things that we're talking about, but I'm like, all right, where's the stuff? Where's the things that are happening? And I said to our good mutual colleague John Rouse, I'm like, I get as equally hopeful as I do traumatized when I talk to you, because I'm so excited about the amazing things that are happening, but I'm so devastated as to the destruction and the things that are happening to our children that I'm so torn. But it takes all of us doing this work. And again, I just want to thank you, Michael, for the work you're doing. I know you've been at Parliament House. I know you've been advocating and training, and you've been over to Interpol, and you've been all over the world talking about this stuff, and you do it day in and day out. So on behalf of the survivors, I just want to thank you for the work that you do, and for continuously showing up and being a voice for us. So I get goosebumps. I really do appreciate you and your work. So
thanks so much, Kel. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate everything that you're doing. It's really brilliant.
Getting there. Learning from the best. Hey, Michael. So guys, if you would like to grab, so I'll just quickly chuck up my free ebook, which is hopefully my lovely friend will pop that up on the screen. It is Finding Your Freedom After Trauma and Abuse. So you can grab a free copy of that. You can order Unscathed Beauty from my website. Next week, I have the amazing Melinda Tenkard-Rees and Maya Melham, who's a lawyer who works with the Royal Commission, who'll be chatting with us about sextortion and harmful sexual behavior. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. So please make sure that you tune in next week. Thank you for being part of the studio audience and for your input. And if you've got any issues with the content, just please make sure you head to my website at kellyhumphries.com. There's lots of support numbers on there that you can reach out to. So thank you again, Michael. I'm sure we are going to get you back again because I have so many more questions for you. It was just so interesting. And again, just lifting the lid off some of that offending. We need to hear it. We've got to be having this conversation. So, all right. Thanks, guys. We'll catch up next time.